story about a hero. She is an unlikely hero, however. It's hard to know when things began to go downhill for her, because we know very little of her early life. The first time we meet her, she is married to one of the sons of the famous Judah. It was thought by many that she was probably from Canaan, a dreaded Canaanite, rather than from Israel, the chosen people of God, but we don't even know that for sure. What we do know for sure is that by the time she enters the pages of the Bible, her story does not go well. She is married to a man known as and was pronounced by the Lord to be wicked. And promptly dies, leaving her a widow. Now today things aren't necessarily very good for widows. Sure, in our country and culture there is a safety net, a system that would help protect widows from the worst that poverty might bring. But that's not true throughout the rest of the world. And even in our day, in some places the outlook for a widow is very dire indeed. And that is closer to the truth when she lived in the ancient world, full of strange and unfamiliar customs. Widows were without a man in a world where attachment to a man was everything you needed for survival. If a widow could not rely upon her own family, or there were no children to help her out, then her situation was very dire indeed. The form of social safety net, a welfare program for widows, if you wish to think of it that way, was a strange and unfamiliar custom to us, but one which was widely practiced in the world in which she lived, and even continued for centuries after that, well into the time when Jesus lived. This was a custom in which, if a man died and left his widow with no sons, then the husband's brother would marry that widow and give her a son, so that the name of the man who died would not be forgotten. And it has the happy side effect that the widow would be provided for. And so it was for her. The safety net kicked in. Had a younger brother, and Judah, her father-in-law, told brother Onan to marry her. But this was not the lifeline that she may have hoped, and her story goes downhill even from here. Even though Onan did in fact marry her, and did in fact treat her like his wife, in that he slept with her, he refused to fulfill the part of the strange, at least to modern ears, custom that would allow her to have children to carry on the name of her deceased husband, and also to have children who might support her in her old age. Onan used her body, but he made sure that she never got pregnant, so she could not have children that would mess up his own family inheritance. She knew what it was to be used and abused. And just when she thought she was at the lowest place she could possibly be, Onan died too. In fact, the story tells us that what Onan did to her was so despicable that the Lord caused his death. And so now she is twice widowed and still without a child. Still there was some hope, that last lifeline by which she might be able to both have a child to carry on the name of her deceased husband and have some hope to be provided for. There was one more brother, Shelah, who could, when he was old enough, marry her. And Judah, her father-in-law, was supposed to look out for her and protect her and to help her. But now even Judah turned against her. Perhaps he was thinking that she was bad luck, that she was the common thread between the two sons who had died. And so he sent her back to her father's house, just until the boy Shelah grew up a little, he said. Now going back to her home where she'd grown up in might seem like a mercy, but in reality it was just another step downward for her, in a life that had already visited tragedy upon her. She's described as wearing widow's clothing all the time, and that means she's not free to find a husband outside of this family who cared so little for her, they simply wanted to put her away and forget about her. Judah put her somewhere where he didn't have to think about her, didn't really have to care for her day-to-day needs. But he didn't release her from the bond that she had to his family. He still controlled her. He pretended he was waiting until Shelah was old enough to marry her, but he had deceived her. He had no intention of giving his third son in marriage to her. He was content to leave her where she was, out of sight, out of mind, but never free from his grip or command. She was not free to start her life over, to strike out on her own, or to find a new husband and family. Judah essentially made her a prisoner in her father's house, with no means of helping herself or escaping the situation she was in. Her story involves a combination of tragedy and abuse. Judah misuses his power over one who was powerless. She was powerless because she was a woman in a world that valued men. She was powerless because she was twice widowed with no children, and thus had no money and no way to support herself. And she was powerless because Judah had decided to neither free her nor help her. And so this woman who was powerless decided to act to right this injustice done to her. When she heard that Judah had recently become a widower himself, and he was traveling to shear his sheep, an occasion which was often accompanied by partying and celebration, she saw her opportunity to act, and so she did. Now this is the part of the story that we often get hung up on. If we stretch our minds, then perhaps we can understand that law that we've been speaking of, where a man marries his brother's wife if she is widowed with no children to provide her with children and a home. This is known as Levite marriage. We might understand it even if we find it hard to imagine, even if it retains a bit of an ick factor for us. But this next part in the story is where we often get stuck. Because in her action to right the injustice done to her, she uses what she has available to her in this situation. That's her sexuality. She dresses up. She covers her face with a veil. Judah doesn't recognize her. And she goes and sits down in the road where he is traveling so that he will see her. Now it should be noted that she dressed up, she veiled herself as the story puts it, but Judah does all the inferring on his own. He assumes that she is sitting there in order to satisfy his pleasures. He assumes she's a prostitute. And so he propositions her. They settle on the price of a goat, which of course he does not have on him. So she asks for some assurance that she will get paid for this encounter. And she takes his seal, cord, and staff. This is a little bit like if he'd left his driver's license and credit cards with her. They definitely belonged to him. They were a key source of his identification. And so Judah employs her services, and once he is finished, he carries on his way. He sends his servant back a little bit later to try and pay the agreed upon price and to get his ID back, but the locals are mystified. There's no prostitute who plies her trade there. And so confused, but seemingly not too concerned, Judah lets the matter drop. We cannot blame this woman for bringing Judah down. Judah was caught in a web that he himself had weaved by refusing to do justice for a widow for whom he was responsible. And he himself, upon seeing her by that road, had decided to approach her as a prostitute, and he had slept with her. It's worth noting that while this is her story is set in the larger context of the stories of the children of Jacob. Judah, who was her father-in-law, has a brother named Joseph, whose name you will probably recognize. And Judah has not been doing well for a while now. He seems to be almost in a downward spiral, which culminates in his unjust treatment of this woman, sleeping with someone he assumes is a prostitute and thinking not very much of it. Judah was hardly a paragon of virtue, and this is just the latest in his string of wrongdoing. She did not bring a good man down. He brought himself down, and and she was just trying to make sure she didn't go down with him. So why did she do what she did? Well, it was an action that she could actually take in a world where she had almost no other options. Surely if there were another way that she could get justice for herself, she would have taken it. However, this law that we've mentioned a few times now, where a man would marry his brother's widow in order to produce a child, it was still in effect for her. She's wearing widow's clothing in her father's house, which means she's unable to marry another person because Judah had not released her to do so. She was bound to Judah's family. She was awaiting the levar, or brother-in-law. Usually it was a brother who fulfilled this duty, but there is some evidence from the ancient world that if there was no brother to fulfill this role, it could be opened up to other male family members, even the husband's father himself. And so it seems that while this was within the accepted custom of the time, and again we have to put away our own kind of judgment on this and see this for what it was, a way of carrying on the family name, which was a huge consideration for people in the ancient world, and also a way of giving a widow a way to live and a family and a place in society. And Tamar was acting within the bounds of this law. She's acting within the existing laws, which Judah and his family were supposed to keep, but Onan and then Judah had broken this law by treating Tamar as they did. But she remained loyal to this family when they had done nothing but turn their back on her. And when the Bible looks back on her story, they regard her well. She's a hero. Other characters name their children after her. She rises in opinion in the biblical memory. The Bible writers don't get hung up on the fact that she posed by the side of the road, was taken for a prostitute, and used herself in this way. And so I hope that we won't let this bother us too much either. Because here's the thing, in the pages of the Bible, she's considered a hero. She's the hero of this story. She's the one who remains loyal to Judah's family, who sacrifices herself in taking this huge risk that she takes. And this is made plain by what happens next. After her dealings with Judah, she puts back on her widow's clothing, goes back to her father's house, and then it becomes very plain a few months later that she is in fact pregnant. At which point Judah, upon hearing the news, immediately pronounces judgment without any witnesses at all, and declares that she be burned. This incident also demonstrates how very much she is still under his thumb, even though she no longer lives in his household, because he has the opportunity to command her fate and order her death. He has not fulfilled his duty to her by withholding his youngest son from marrying her, but he also does not let her find another life of her own. And he commands that she be put to death for her adultery against the son that he never intended to give her in marriage. But she was cannier than he knew. And she suddenly produces that ID that he had left behind with her to guarantee payment. And Judah is taken aback, and he's forced to admit that he does indeed recognize the seal, cord, and staff, for they are his. And then he makes the following declaration: "She is righteous, not I." Now that is something. The word righteous is used of only two people in all of the book of Genesis: Noah and the character we're discussing, Tamar. For this is, of course, Tamar's story. And Tamar is the only woman in the Hebrew Bible who is called righteous. Righteous is a very important word. It's not used lightly in the scriptures. Righteousness is an attribute of God. But when we read Tamar against the other people in this story, Tamar is indeed the one who is righteous. She fought to preserve Judah's family when Judah was only trying to protect himself and his family from the wrong person in this story. He was trying to protect them from Tamar. And in trying to protect his family, he wronged her, leaving her stuck and powerless. Judah was looking out for himself. Tamar was laying down her life for this family. She is the hero of the story. We know that Tamar did right in the Lord's eyes because her plan succeeded. It was no coincidence that she was enabled to conceive, and she became the mother of twin sons. In the scriptures, being able to conceive a child was considered to be a blessing from God. And so it seems that Tamar was paid back double for what she'd suffered, and the birth of her twins saved Judah's family line. Judah's family line. And Onan died childless, if you will remember. He has one other son, Shelah, who exits the scriptures at this point, and we never hear from him again. But through these twin sons, Judah's family line continues. And Judah is an ancestor of King David, and also an ancestor of Jesus the Messiah. And it even seems possible from this story that Judah was saved by Tamar. We mentioned before that Judah was in a slide, a downward spiral at this point in his life. After all, if you read before this in the scriptures, it was Judah's idea to sell his brother Joseph into slavery when they trapped him in a pit. But after meeting Tamar, and after this story concludes, Judah begins to change. And when we meet Judah again, instead of acting selfishly in the story of Joseph that's going on the entire time that this story is going on, Judah offers himself in the place of another of his brothers, Benjamin. And Judah enters the family line, as we've said, of some pretty illustrious people in Scripture. And so, in fact, does Tamar. In the book of Ruth, Tamar is mentioned as the mother of Perez. And this makes Tamar an ancestress of the King David. Later in 1 Chronicles, Tamar is mentioned again as in the nation's historic memory as the queen mother who makes the birth of King David possible. And even more than this, Tamar is the first woman of the New Testament. Mentioned even before Mary or Elizabeth, Tamar is the first woman mentioned in Matthew's genealogy of Jesus. You see, it turns out that Tamar's story was never fully told until it's told as part of the ongoing story that God is writing, that God wrote all throughout the Old Testament into the New Testament through the life of Jesus, the life of the church that we read about in the pages of the New Testament, and that God is still writing today. She is part of the line of Jesus the Messiah. And that is where her story belongs. She's a hero of the Bible. She's instrumental in bringing Jesus into the world, and she's a savior, a hero who saves Judah's family line and who even saves Judah himself. She ends up being the thread through which are born all of the Israelite royalty. Her crowning glory comes when her name is inscribed in the family tree that leads to Jesus, the Messiah. Tamar's story is part of the story that God is writing in the world. And not only that, even though modern readers have trouble with her story and often judge Tamar quite negatively, she's declared righteous in this story. And when we consider Tamar's story, I think we should let the witness of the Bible stand. She was a hero. She saved others, and she shows us what righteousness looks like in difficult circumstances. Even though her story is difficult to understand and appreciate, what would it look like if we made Tamar our friend, who could show us something about righteous living in difficult situations?